I had always imagined my first step into adulthood would be filled with excitement. After years of school, late-night studying, and pushing through endless assignments, college was meant to be my reward, the beginning of something new and exciting. I had been dreaming about this moment for as long as I could remember. For as long as I could remember, my parents had always told me they were saving up for my college fund. Every time I mentioned a dream school or a particular career path I was passionate about, they reassured me that they were doing everything they could to make sure I had the opportunity to pursue it. My future was planned out, at least financially, and I felt secure in that knowledge. My sister Emma was 2 years younger than me, and while we loved each other, we never really saw eye to eye on anything. She was always the more serious, focused one, while I was the dreamer. She excelled in school, particularly in math and science, and often talked about becoming a doctor. I admired her dedication, but at the same time, I always felt a little overshadowed by her. Still, I assumed that my path had already been laid out by my parents' promises to fund my education. I would go to college, I would chase my dreams, and life would unfold as planned. But one evening, everything came crashing down. It was a Tuesday night when it happened. My parents called me into the living room after dinner. I remember the way the room felt unusually quiet that night. Normally, our house was filled with the sounds of laughter, clinking dishes, and TV shows running in the background. But that evening, the atmosphere felt heavy, almost like something was amiss. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just another routine family chat, but the tone in my parents' voices when they spoke to me was different. They seemed nervous, unsure of how to break some kind of bad news. "Sit down, sweetie," my mom said, patting the seat beside her on the couch. Her voice was calm but slightly strained. I glanced at my dad, who was leaning forward, his hands clasped together in a way that made me uncomfortable. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint it. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice a little more clipped than I intended. I had always been close with my parents, but I could tell by their body language that whatever they were about to say would be difficult to hear. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, their eyes lingering on each other for a moment, as if silently debating how best to break the news. I felt my stomach tighten as I sat back, waiting for them to speak. "Sweetheart," my dad began, his voice low, "we need to talk to you about something important." There it was, the moment I had been dreading. I could feel my heart rate spike as I braced myself for whatever was coming. "We've decided to give your college fund to Emma," my mom said, her words hitting me like a slap in the face. "We know this may come as a surprise, but after a lot of thinking, we believe it's the right decision." The words didn't immediately make sense. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what she had just said. My mind raced, searching for the context I was missing. What did she mean? Emma, my sister. Why her? Why now? "What do you mean?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. You can't be serious. My college fund? Why?" My dad sighed deeply, his face drawn with regret. "Emma has always been passionate about becoming a doctor. She's been working toward that goal for years. Your mom and I have been talking about it, and we feel that the funds we've saved for your education would be better used for her future. It's not that we don't care about you, but her medical school is going to be expensive, and we think this will give her the best shot at her dream." It was like the ground had shifted beneath me. My world, once stable and clear, now felt unstable, as if I were caught in a storm. I had always assumed that the money my parents had saved would be for me, to help me reach my goals, to ease the burden of student loans. But now that plan had been taken away, handed over to Emma. "You're giving my college fund to her?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What about me? What about my future?" I didn't want to sound like a brat, but the hurt and confusion were too overwhelming to keep inside. All the dreams I had built up, the college tours, the applications I'd sent out, it all felt pointless now. I was left standing there with no clear path forward, no way to chase the life I had always imagined. "I know this is hard to understand, honey," my dad said gently, "but we really think this is the best thing for the family. Emma's got a real shot at being a doctor, and that requires a lot of financial support. You've got a lot of time ahead of you, and there will be other options available when it's your turn." "Other options?" I repeated, my voice rising now. So what? You're telling me that Emma's dream is more important than mine? You've been saving this money for me my whole life, and now you're just going to give it to her? Mom's eyes welled up as she reached for my hand, but I pulled away, unable to look at her. "It's not like that, honey," she said softly. "We want what's best for both of you, but we're being realistic. Medical school is expensive. You know how much Emma has wanted this. And your future isn't in danger. We'll help you when it's time for you to go to school, just not right now. We've been talking about this for months. Please, try to understand." But how could I understand? How could I accept that the future I had spent so long planning for had been ripped away in an instant? I had worked hard. I had earned this. And yet, here I was, left with nothing but disappointment. "I don't know what to say," I muttered, standing up abruptly and pacing the room. "I thought you would support me too. I thought this was my time. I thought you had a plan for me, not just for Emma." "You're being dramatic," Emma's voice cut through the conversation. I hadn't even noticed her standing in the doorway, silently watching everything unfold. "I'm the one who's been working my butt off to get into med school. You should be happy for me." I froze, staring at her in disbelief. I didn't even know how to respond to her coldness. "I'm sorry," she added, her expression unreadable. "But this is what's happening. You'll figure something out." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the silence that followed her words, a silence so heavy I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run away. I felt so completely and utterly alone. I had never felt so small and insignificant in my own home. The future I had dreamed of seemed to slip further and further away, and all I could do was watch in helplessness as it disappeared. I didn't know what to do next. All I knew was that I had to find a way to make it through this. I had to find a way to get to college, to pursue my dreams, no matter how impossible that seemed in the moment. But right then, all I could feel was the sting of betrayal and the overwhelming weight of uncertainty. The following days felt like an endless loop of confusion and anger. After that night, I hardly spoke to anyone. I kept my distance from my parents, feeling betrayed, and my sister, Emma, who hadn't once looked back to check on how I was coping. I stayed in my room most of the time, trying to process everything in silence, but nothing made sense. I kept thinking, why me? Why did this have to happen to me? The questions ran in my head on a constant loop. There was no explanation I could find that would make me feel better, no way to understand why my parents had made this decision. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being left behind. While Emma, the golden child, had always been their priority, I had always been the one who was more independent, who wasn't as vocal about her needs. My parents had seen my quietness as strength, as something to be proud of, but now it felt like it had been a huge mistake. That now that plan had been taken away, handed over to Emma. "You're giving my college fund to her?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What about me? What about my future?" I didn't want to sound like a brat, but the hurt and confusion were too overwhelming to keep inside. All the dreams I had built up, the college tours, the applications I'd sent out, it all felt pointless now. I was left standing there with no clear path forward, no way to chase the life I had always imagined. "I know this is hard to understand, honey," my dad said gently, "but we really think this is the best thing for the family. Emma's got a real shot at being a doctor, and that requires a lot of financial support. You've got a lot of time ahead of you, and there will be other options available when it's your turn." "Other options?" I repeated, my voice rising now. "So what, you're telling me that Emma's dream is more important than mine? You've been saving this money for me my whole life, and now you're just going to give it to her?" Mom's eyes welled up as she reached for my hand, but I pulled away, unable to look at her. "It's not like that, honey," she said softly. "We want what's best for both of you, but we're being realistic. Medical school is expensive. You know how much Emma has wanted this, and your future isn't in danger. We'll help you when it's time for you to go to school, just not right now. We've been talking about this for months. Please try to understand." But how could I understand? How could I accept that the future I had spent so long planning for had been ripped away in an instant? I had worked hard. I had earned this. And yet, here I was, left with nothing but disappointment. "I don't know what to say," I muttered, standing up abruptly and pacing the room. "I thought you would support me too. I thought this was my time. I thought you had a plan for me, not just for Emma." "You're being dramatic." Emma's voice cut through the conversation. I hadn't even noticed her standing in the doorway, silently watching everything unfold. "I'm the one who's been working my butt off to get into med school. You should be happy for me." I froze, staring at her in disbelief. I didn't even know how to respond to her coldness. "I'm sorry," she added, her expression unreadable, "but this is what's happening. You'll figure something out." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the silence that followed her words. A silence so heavy I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run away. I felt so completely and utterly alone. I had never felt so small and insignificant in my own home. The future I had dreamed of seemed to slip further and further away, and all I could do was watch in helplessness as it disappeared. I didn't know what to do next. All I knew was that I had to find a way to make it through this. I had to find a way to get to college, to pursue my dreams, no matter how impossible that seemed in the moment. But right then, all I could feel was the sting of betrayal and the overwhelming weight of uncertainty. The following days felt like an endless loop of confusion and anger. After that night, I hardly spoke to anyone. I kept my distance from my parents, feeling betrayed, and my sister, Emma, who hadn't once looked back to check on how I was coping. I stayed in my room most of the time, trying to process everything in silence. But nothing made sense. I kept thinking, why me? Why did this have to happen to me? The questions ran in my head on a constant loop. There was no explanation I could find that would make me feel better, no way to understand why my parents had made this decision. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being left behind. While Emma, the golden child, had always been their priority, I had always been the one who was more independent, who wasn't as vocal about her needs. My parents had seen my quietness as strength, as something to be proud of. But now it felt like it had been a huge mistake. I had kept my head down, done what was expected of me, and yet, here I was, out in the cold. My parents had always told me that I would be the one to go to college without any major financial worries, that my future would be supported. But in the blink of an eye, that promise was gone, erased by the simple fact that Emma's dreams had taken priority. I spent the following few days avoiding everyone. I avoided my parents' eyes, too afraid that they would see the hurt in mine. I avoided Emma because I couldn't stand to look at her without feeling resentment. She was oblivious to my pain, lost in her own world of med school applications and future plans. She had always been a good kid, a smart kid, but the way she acted now felt so detached. I couldn't help but feel a little angry at her too. Did she even care about what this meant for me? Did she understand how much I was sacrificing for her to follow her dream? But I couldn't say anything, because it wasn't her fault. It was my parents' decision, not hers. That weekend, I had a long conversation with my best friend, Sarah. She was the one person who seemed to understand, the one who was truly there for me during this time. I had vented to her over the phone about the whole situation, and she listened with a patience that no one else had. Sarah had always been a voice of reason when I needed it most, and I had a feeling this conversation was going to be no different. "It's just so unfair, Sarah," I said, pacing back and forth in my room. "How can they do this to me? I worked just as hard as Emma. I've been just as good of a kid, but they just handed it all to her. Like, I don't even matter." "I know it's tough," Sarah said, her voice steady on the other end of the line. "But have you tried talking to your parents about it? Maybe they don't realize how much this is affecting you." "I don't even know where to start," I replied, sinking onto the edge of my bed. "I tried talking to them the other night, but they just kept saying that Emma needs it more. They kept talking about how important her medical career is, but what about me? What about my future?" "You need to have a real conversation with them, where you don't just react with anger. I know you're hurt, but it sounds like they need to understand what this means to you. Maybe they don't see it the same way you do." I sat in silence for a moment, thinking about her words. It was true that I hadn't really talked to my parents calmly since they made the announcement. I had been too overwhelmed, too emotional to express my hurt in a way that would make them understand. I had lashed out in anger instead of trying to communicate how much their decision had devastated me. "I just don't know if they'll understand, Sarah," I said quietly. "I don't know if they'll ever see it from my side." "Maybe not, but you won't know until you try." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Sarah's advice over and over in my mind. What did I have to lose by talking to my parents again? Sure, they had made up their minds already, but it wasn't like I had to accept everything they said without challenge. I wasn't a child anymore. I could have a say in my future, but the problem was that I didn't know where to start. How could I make them see how important my dreams were if they were already so focused on Emma's future? The next morning, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with my mom and dad. They were both sipping coffee, not looking at me directly, as if afraid of what I might say. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. It was as if they were bracing themselves for another argument. But I had made up my mind to approach this differently. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," I started, my voice surprisingly calm considering how furious I had been the day before. "And I still don't understand it. I don't understand why you're giving Emma my college fund. I worked hard for this, too. I've always been there for you guys. Why isn't my future just as important as Emma's?" Mom looked up from her coffee, her eyes soft but filled with guilt. "Honey, we never meant to hurt you. We thought Emma needed it more. Her education will be much more expensive and she's worked so hard for it." "I've worked hard too, Mom," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I've done everything you asked me to. I've been patient, I've been responsible, but now it feels like my dreams don't matter. It feels like nothing I've done matters." Dad's face tightened and he set down his coffee cup. "We're not saying that, sweetie. We're just making decisions based on what we think is best for all of us. This isn't easy for us either." "I don't care about what's easy for you," I shot back, my frustration bubbling over. "I care about my future. And now you're telling me I have to figure it out on my own after you've taken away the one thing I was counting on?" I stood up abruptly, pacing again, the anger I had been holding inside now spilling out in waves. I didn't care about being calm anymore. I had been calm for too long. "I don't know what to do now," I said, my voice shaking. "I thought you were going to help me, but now I'm just left here with nothing." There was a long silence between us, and I could feel the weight of my words hanging in the air. My parents didn't say anything for a while, and I almost thought they were about to apologize. But instead, my dad let out a sigh, deep and resigned. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said quietly, "but you have to understand Emma's future is different. It's more immediate. We thought you'd be okay, but now I see we should have listened to you sooner." I stopped pacing and looked at him. "What does that mean? What's going to happen to me?" Mom reached out and grabbed my hand gently. "We're not abandoning you, sweetheart. We'll figure it out. We'll find a way to help you. It's complicated." The conversation didn't really resolve anything, and I left the kitchen feeling just as lost as I had before. They didn't fully understand what I was going through, but at least they were starting to see it. I wasn't going to give up on my future, but it was clear that it wouldn't be easy. Everything had just become a lot more complicated than I had ever imagined. And the hardest part was realizing that even though my parents hadn't meant to hurt me, I still felt betrayed. I still felt as if my dreams had been brushed aside in favor of someone else's. The disappointment was deep, and it wasn't something that would disappear overnight. It was going to take time. Time to heal, time to figure out my next steps, and time to rebuild what felt like a shattered trust. It had been weeks since the conversation with my parents, and things had only become more tense in our house. I had tried, in my own way, to move forward, but nothing felt the same. My parents still stood firm in their decision to redirect my college fund to Emma, and no matter how many times I expressed my feelings, it seemed as though their minds were made up. We barely spoke about it anymore, as if the subject had become too painful to revisit, but despite the silence, the hurt continued to simmer beneath the surface, and I could tell that my relationship with my family had changed. It wasn't just the disappointment that was hanging between us. It was the unspoken words, the unresolved tension. I didn't know how we were supposed to move past it, or if we ever would. One afternoon, as I was sitting in my room trying to distract myself from the weight of the situation, I received a letter. It wasn't a usual piece of mail. It was thick with heavy paper, and the return address was from my grandpa, who lived several states away. Grandpa was old-fashioned. He preferred sending handwritten letters over emails and phone calls. His letters were always full of advice, long stories about his childhood, and the occasional joke about his adventures in the old days. I hadn't heard from him in a while, and the sight of the envelope made my heart skip a beat. Maybe, just maybe, he was reaching out because he had heard about what had been going on with me. Maybe this letter was the solution I had been searching for. I sat down at my desk, carefully tearing open the envelope. Inside, there was a folded sheet of crisp, aged paper with Grandpa's familiar handwriting. His letters always had this old-school charm, neat, deliberate, and somehow calming. I started reading, feeling the anticipation grow with each word. Dear, I hope this letter finds you well, although I'm sure things may feel a little uncertain right now. I've heard from your parents about the situation regarding your college plans. First, let me say that I'm proud of you for all the hard work you've put into your education, and I understand how difficult it must be to feel overlooked in this moment. It sounds like your family has been dealing with a complicated decision, one that has left you feeling as if your dreams are on hold. I know you may not have realized this, but I've been keeping something from your parents for a while now, and I believe it's time I share it with you. I've set aside money specifically for your education. It's not much, but it should be enough to help you go to college without the weight of student loans hanging over you. I've kept this a secret for some time, but after hearing what's been happening, I think it's the right time for you to know. Your education was important to me, and I want you to know that I haven't forgotten it. I'll explain more when I see you next. In the meantime, please don't let this setback deter you. I know you're capable of achieving great things, and I'm here to help you in any way I can. With all my love. Gamper. I reread the letter 3 times, trying to comprehend what I had just read. Grandpa had known about the situation with my parents, and more than that, he had planned ahead. He had set aside money for my education, money that had been hidden from everyone, including my parents. It was a trust, something he had quietly built up over the years, and now it was ready for me. I could hardly believe it. All the disappointment and anger that had been building up inside me for the past few weeks seemed to melt away in an instant. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. My grandpa, the one person who had always understood me, had come through when I needed it the most. As the days passed, I thought more about the letter. Grandpa hadn't explained all the details yet, but I could already feel the impact of his words. There was a sense of relief that washed over me. A weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying had been lifted. I could go to college. I could follow my dreams. And it wasn't because my parents had come to their senses. It was because Grandpa had believed in me enough to take action on his own. A few days later, Grandpa called to check in. The moment I heard his familiar voice on the other end of the line, I felt a rush of gratitude. It was strange. In the midst of all the tension at home, his voice felt like a lifeline. "Hey there, kiddo. I take it you got my letter?" Grandpa's voice was warm, rich with that distinct gravelly tone that only age could bring. "Yeah, Grandpa, I did. I don't even know what to say. I had no idea. I didn't even know you had been saving money for me." "Well, I wasn't exactly broadcasting it," he chuckled. "But I always knew that, when the time came, you'd need a little help. I wanted to make sure you weren't left out in the cold. It's not much, but it'll help cover some of the costs. And I know you'll make it work." I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I pushed it back. I didn't want to start crying on the phone with Grandpa, not when I finally felt like I was gaining some control over the situation. "I don't know how to thank you, Grandpa. This means everything to me." "I don't need thanks, kid. Just promise me you'll use it wisely. Don't get lost in the frustration. Don't let it stop you from doing what you love. This world's full of people who try to keep you down, but I know you've got the strength to push through it. You've got a good head on your shoulders." Those words, simple, straightforward, but full of meaning, stuck with me long after the call ended. Grandpa didn't see this as a huge sacrifice, and neither did I. But the fact that he had thought of me, that he had quietly supported me all this time, made me realize how much he truly cared. In the face of everything that had been happening with my parents, I hadn't expected this kind of support. I hadn't even known it was possible. Grandpa had given me a way forward when I thought all hope was lost. Over the next few days, I spent time thinking about what I needed to do next. Grandpa's gift was a lifeline, but it didn't solve everything. I would still need to figure out how to explain this to my parents. There was no way I could just go to school with the money Grandpa had set aside for me without having some difficult conversations. But I didn't feel as hopeless anymore. Grandpa had given me the space to believe in myself again, to see that there were other options. I talked to Grandpa again a few days later, and he walked me through the process of how the money was set up. It wasn't just a lump sum. It was an investment structured in a way that would help me cover the costs of my education over time. It was a simple setup, nothing extravagant, but it was exactly what I needed. I didn't have to worry about the debt that would otherwise follow me out of school. I didn't have to feel burdened by the unfairness of my parents' decision. I had a way out, a path that was mine to take. With Grandpa's plan in place, I started to feel like I had some control over my future again. It wasn't going to be easy, and I still had a lot of work ahead of me, but at least I wasn't alone in this. Grandpa was there, rooting for me, making sure I had the chance to go after what I wanted, and that made all the difference. In the weeks that followed, I began applying to colleges again, this time with renewed focus and determination. The rejection I had felt from my parents was still there, but it didn't sting as much anymore. I had something to look forward to. I had a future to build on, and I wasn't going to let anyone, not even my own family, stand in my way. But before I could get too comfortable in this newfound sense of hope, I knew I would have to confront my parents about the money Grandpa had set aside for me. I wasn't sure how they would react. Would they be angry, disappointed, or would they finally see what I had been trying to tell them all along? I wasn't sure, but I was ready. Ready to stand up for myself, ready to prove that my dreams were just as important as anyone else's, ready to take the first step toward a future that was truly mine. I had spent weeks wrestling with the decision. Despite Grandpa's secret plan and his support, the nagging feeling that I hadn't yet resolved the situation with my parents remained. It was like an open wound that couldn't fully heal, no matter how much I tried to numb the pain. I had avoided confronting my parents about Grandpa's gift, mostly because I didn't know how they would react. There was a part of me that feared they would feel betrayed, or worse, that they would resent me for taking the money behind their backs. But then again, I realized that if I didn't have that conversation now, the tension would only continue to build. I couldn't keep avoiding the truth forever. The time had come to speak up. The day I decided to have the talk, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. It wasn't just about the college fund anymore. It was about the larger picture, the communication breakdown, the unspoken expectations, and the overwhelming sense of abandonment I had felt for the last few months. It was about my future, but it was also about my relationship with my family. I couldn't go to college carrying that resentment, that burden of silence. And I knew that if I didn't confront them now, I would never be able to move forward. But the uncertainty of their reactions still hung in the air like a dark cloud. That evening, I sat down at the kitchen table, waiting for my parents to finish dinner. I had planned it carefully, trying to pick a moment when I knew we would be alone and undistracted. When they finally came into the room, I could tell they were expecting the usual silence, the usual avoidance. But tonight was different. I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. I had to speak my truth. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you about something," I said, my voice steady but with a nervous edge. They both looked up at me, their expressions guarded but not hostile. They could tell something was different, something was coming, and they both braced themselves. "Of course, sweetheart, what's on your mind?" Dad asked, setting his coffee mug down and giving me a slightly strained smile. "I've been thinking a lot about everything lately," I began, glancing at both of them. "And I think it's time I tell you something you might not know." I took a deep breath, my heart racing. Now that the moment had come, the words felt heavier than I had expected. But I pushed forward. "Grandpa reached out to me," I continued, watching their faces carefully. "He's been saving money for my education. I know you didn't know about it, but He set aside some funds that will help me go to college without the pressure of taking out loans. It's not much, but it's enough. There was a long silence in the room. My parents exchanged a glance, and I could see the tension building in their eyes. Dad's face hardened slightly, his brow furrowing. "Why didn't you tell us about this earlier?" Mama asked, her voice tight, though there was no anger in it, more like a quiet disappointment. "I didn't want to make it harder than it already was," I replied, the words coming out before I had time to process them. I didn't want to rub it in, but the truth is, I'm not okay with what happened. I've worked hard, and I've been doing everything right, but it felt like none of that mattered, like I was forgotten in favor of Emma. Mom looked down, clearly struggling with what I was saying. Dad, on the other hand, had become more defensive. "We didn't forget about you," Dad said, his voice stern. "We made a choice based on what we thought was best for the family. Emma needs the support right now. She's pursuing a career in medicine, something that takes a lot of resources. You'll be fine. You'll find a way." I felt the anger welling up inside me again, but I held it back. I had come this far. I wasn't going to let this turn into another fight. "It's not just about the money, Dad," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's about feeling like my future isn't as important as Emma's. It's about feeling like all the work I've put into my future doesn't matter, and that hurts. It really hurts." There was another long pause. I could see the conflict in their faces. They weren't angry, but they were defensive. They hadn't seen it from my perspective, and now that they were hearing it, I wasn't sure how they would take it. My mom looked at me, her expression softening. "I didn't realize you felt that way," she said quietly. "We just wanted what was best for both of you." "I know you wanted what was best, Mom," I said, trying to steady my emotions. "But I'm not Emma. I'm not her, and I'm not asking for the same things. I just wanted the same opportunity. I wanted the chance to build my own future, too." For a moment, neither of them spoke. I could see them processing, their minds working through everything I had just said. And then, slowly, Dad exhaled and looked at me directly. "I didn't realize you felt like that," he said quietly, his voice now gentler. "I thought you were okay. You've always been so independent, and I guess I just assumed you'd figure it out. But that was wrong. You've always had your own dreams, and you deserve the support to go after them. I'm sorry for not seeing that." Mom nodded, her eyes a little misty. "I'm sorry, too. I guess we've been so focused on what was easiest to manage that we didn't stop to think about what was fair for you. You should have had a voice in this decision. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't the apology I had wanted, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement that I had been hurt and that they hadn't meant to do it. They hadn't meant to overlook me. In that moment, I realized that the most important thing wasn't the money or the college fund. What mattered was that my parents were finally starting to see me, really see me, for who I was and what I needed. They were acknowledging my pain, and that was a step in the right direction. After that conversation, things between my parents and I began to shift. There wasn't an immediate fix, but I could feel the tension slowly easing. We had taken a step forward, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like my relationship with them was rebuilding. A few days later, Dad sat down with me to talk about next steps. He told me that they would support my college application process and they would help where they could, though they couldn't match what Grandpa had given me, but that was okay. What mattered most was that they were trying. They were finally understanding why this was important to me. Grandpa's money, though a crucial part of my journey, wasn't the only thing that had changed in the last few weeks. What really made a difference was that I had found my voice again. I had stopped being the quiet child who always followed the rules and silently accepted whatever came her way. I had learned to stand up for myself, to express my pain, and to ask for what I deserved. That was something no amount of money could buy. As the months passed, I moved forward with my college applications, fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. My parents and I had worked through our differences, and I knew there was still a long road ahead. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt, but I was ready for them. Grandpa's support had been the catalyst I needed to rediscover my strength, but it was the conversations, the honesty, and the hard work that had really brought me to a place of healing. I wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally in control of it. I had found a way to carve out my own path, and that was enough for me. I didn't need anyone's approval to live the life I wanted. I was going to go to college, follow my dreams, and make the future I had always imagined, one step at a time.